Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back into a world where silence had weight, power wore a crown, and one woman's final days blurred the line between myth and reality. We begin with the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Not just a moment in time, but the closing of one of the most iconic chapters in English history. Now, before you settle in, take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy historical deep dives that bring the past to life, one whispered story at a time. Go ahead, we're just getting started. Elizabeth I, the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, reigned for 44 years. Her time on the throne brought with it a flourishing of the arts, decisive naval victories, and the strengthening of England's identity as a global power. But even as her image was celebrated across coins, canvases, and courtly verse, the woman beneath the crown aged. And when the final winter of her life arrived in early 1603, it did so quietly, but with a chill that no fire could quite chase away. By that point, Elizabeth was nearly 70, a remarkable age in an era when reaching 40 was considered fortunate. Her skin, once masked in layers of pale, lead-based makeup, now revealed signs of decay beneath. The fiery red wigs she wore so confidently had thinned. The sparkle that once danced behind her famously clever eyes seemed dimmer, more inward. Those closest to her noted the change. Her appetite waned, her appearances at court grew rare, and when she did speak, it was softer, more fleeting, like smoke caught on a draft. Whispers began to weave through the hallways of Richmond Palace, where she had retreated for rest. She wasn't well. But what did not well mean for a queen who had, for decades, held a nation together through willpower alone? She had survived plots, rebellions, and betrayals. She had reigned alone, unmarried, without an heir, navigating a male-dominated world with sharp intellect and sharper diplomacy. But this was different. This wasn't a political threat. This was internal, silent, unstoppable. Her final winter was one of haunting ritual. Servants reported that she would stand for hours on end, sometimes by her bed, sometimes near a cold window. She refused to sleep. She rarely sat. She would speak to no one unless absolutely necessary. There was something about her stillness that disturbed even the most hardened courtiers. It wasn't just age creeping in. It was sorrow, a kind of grief that had lodged itself deep inside her bones. Many believed that grief was rooted in the loss of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He had been one of her favorites, perhaps even something more than a courtly flirtation. Dashing, ambitious, reckless, Essex had risen swiftly under her favor, only to betray her by leading a rebellion in 1601. Elizabeth had no choice but to order his execution. It was the law. It was duty. But when he walked to the scaffold, those who watched said the queen changed. Her fire dulled. Her humor faded. It was as if her spirit had cracked just slightly, and that fracture only deepened as the months passed. In the quiet corners of her chambers, Elizabeth's voice grew thinner. Sometimes, when she did speak, it was said she murmured Essex's name under her breath. Others believed she kept a small locket with his image inside, worn beneath her robes where no one could see. Whether these stories were true or romantic fabrications, one thing was clear. Elizabeth was unraveling, and she was doing it in silence. Physicians were called, of course. They brought tinctures and prayers, tonics and warm compresses. None worked. She refused most of them anyway. She would not be bled. She would not be examined. She would not name a successor. Her body weakened, but her grip on control, on image, on secrecy, never loosened. Even in illness, she demanded to be seen not as fragile, but as sovereign. Her physical decline was visible in the smallest details. Her cough lingered. Her skin, once painted into ghostly perfection, had grown sallow and blemished beneath the makeup. She had grown thin, alarmingly so. Her frame disappeared beneath her royal gowns. Yet she allowed no one to undress her completely. Vanity, perhaps, or something deeper, a fear that to admit weakness was to summon death. The palace around her began to shift. Music stopped. Her courtiers, once eager for favor, spoke in hushed tones. Even her most trusted ladies-in-waiting were dismissed from her bedside one by one. Only a few remained, watching her drift further inward, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes often fixed on empty spaces as if she saw something the living could not. And through it all, there was the silence. That silence stretched longer with each passing day. Ministers brought matters of state to her attention, but she barely acknowledged them. They asked, gently, for guidance on the future. Who would succeed her? She would not answer. They asked if she would rest. She refused. They asked if she would eat. She declined. One report claimed she stood in the same corner of her room for nearly 20 hours straight, unmoving, unspeaking, cloaked in black. It wasn't just the end of a queen. It was the quiet dismantling of a dynasty. With no children, no siblings, no direct heir, the Tudor line would die with her. And everyone knew it. The question was not whether Elizabeth would die, but what her death would leave behind. By the start of March, it was clear that the end was near. But it was coming not with violence or spectacle, but with a slow, devastating fade. Elizabeth I, the woman who had outwitted enemies, silenced dissenters, and ruled an empire, now trembled beneath the weight of her own legacy. And still, she said nothing. As the days of March unspooled with a kind of heavy inevitability, the mood at Richmond Palace shifted from cautious hope to hushed resignation. Courtiers paced in quiet hallways. Nobles lingered near her chamber with downcast eyes, and even the staff, those who had served her meals, dressed her in silks, prepared her wigs, walked more slowly, more deliberately, as though time itself had begun to mourn. Elizabeth I was still alive, but the Queen as England had known her was slipping further from reach with each breath. By now, her refusal to lie down had become symbolic. This wasn't merely physical resistance. There was a deep, unspoken dread behind her upright posture. She would sit on cushions for hours, stiffly, leaning only when her legs began to shake. Her ladies begged her to recline, just to rest for a little while. But she refused again and again. It was as though lying down was an invitation to death, and Elizabeth would not be the one to open that door. Some of her closest attendants, such as Lady Scrope, noticed that even her gestures had grown more minimal, more hesitant. The Queen, who once held court with flashing wit and sharp rhetoric, now moved like a shadow, lips barely parting, eyes often fixed on nothing. When she did speak, it was only in faint murmurs, prayers perhaps, or fragments of thought lost in the echoing corridors of her mind. Ministers still brought state documents, hoping she might rally. She rarely looked at them. Occasionally, she nodded. Once, she waved a hand, as if brushing away the weight of government entirely. Her physicians were at a loss. Without modern tools, no thermometers, no blood tests, no stethoscopes, they relied on old Tudor diagnostics. Imbalances of the four humors, vague notions of melancholia or cold distemper of the brain. Some believed she was afflicted with a spiritual malaise, that grief had soured her blood. Others pointed to the physical signs, weight loss, persistent coughing, pallor, and guessed at pneumonia, a chill taken in the drafty palace halls that had begun to rot her lungs. But none could agree, and none could help. One theory, however, began to gain quiet traction among a few observers: lead poisoning. For decades, Elizabeth had famously adorned her face with a thick white cosmetic paste called Venetian ceruse. It gave her a porcelain glow, otherworldly, regal, iconic. But it was also laced with white lead, a substance now known to be dangerously toxic. Applied daily, layer upon layer, the lead absorbed into her skin, entering her bloodstream slowly but relentlessly. Modern science tells us the symptoms of lead poisoning are harrowingly consistent with Elizabeth's decline: cognitive deterioration, irritability, weight loss, fatigue, tremors, and eventual organ damage. Her teeth had blackened and many had fallen out. Her famously red hair had thinned to nearly nothing, concealed beneath elaborate wigs. Sores bloomed beneath the makeup, hidden behind powder and pearls. Her appearance, still fiercely guarded from the public eye, was now more mask than woman. And yet, Even in these final days, she refused to abandon the illusion. She would not allow herself to be seen unpainted, unadorned. The makeup had become more than vanity. It had become armor, an armor that may have been slowly killing her. Still, there was no definitive diagnosis, only speculation. The queen would not let herself be examined fully. No incisions, no bleeding, no invasive treatments. Modesty, pride, fear, they all blended into one unyielding refusal. To look beneath the surface was to acknowledge what lay there, and Elizabeth would not do that. She had faced down armies, religious uprisings, and political conspiracies. But this battle, this quiet surrender to time, was not one she could strategize her way out of. And while physicians debated and ministers whispered, Elizabeth remained in her chamber, silent, still, and stubbornly upright. Outside the palace, England held its breath. The country had no formal heir. Elizabeth had long refused to name one. For decades, she had danced around the subject, suggesting, hinting, but never declaring. It was widely assumed that James VI of Scotland, son of her executed cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, would inherit the throne. He was Protestant, intelligent, politically astute. He had a strong claim through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor. But he was also a foreign king, raised far from the English court, and not without enemies. Without Elizabeth's formal endorsement, her seal, her voice, there was fear. Fear of civil unrest. Fear of rival claimants. Fear of factionalism rearing its head once more, as it had in the bloody centuries past. And Elizabeth, in her silence, was letting that fear grow. Some claim she eventually nodded when asked if James should be king. Others swore she gestured toward his portrait once, in what seemed like a moment of clarity. A few even whispered she had murmured something, faint, undecipherable, but approving. But none of these stories were official. None could be written into law. England's fate, it seemed, teetered on the edge of a dying woman's breath. And still, the queen would not lie down. The ritual of her stillness had become a kind of vigil. Her attendants took shifts, watching her in the dark hours of the night. They saw her standing in corners, sometimes by the window, sometimes in total shadow, unmoving for what felt like eternities. It was as though she had become part of the palace itself, some ancient, weathered statue that defied time by sheer force of will. When she did move, it was slow. Her legs swelled. Her breathing grew shallow. She collapsed more than once. But even then, she refused help. Once, she was found crumpled on the floor beside her chair, refusing to call out, unwilling to admit weakness. The court grew quiet around her. Conversations ceased. Music was banished. The queen had loved music once, played instruments, sung with joy. Now she demanded silence. And silence she received. At last, after days of upright resistance, her strength gave way. She allowed herself to be placed in bed, not from peace, but from exhaustion. It was the first time in many days that her frail body had touched the mattress. Her ladies moved with reverence, wrapping her in layers of silk and linen, surrounding her with quiet devotion. The moment she lay down, the entire palace seemed to change. There was no ceremony, no proclamation, just stillness. Candles flickered. Curtains muted the daylight. The room felt suspended in time. They knew what it meant. The queen was resting, and death, finally, had been allowed to approach. The image of Elizabeth I lying in her bed, frail and silent, marked the final chapter not just of her life, but of a dynasty that had defined an age. Her chamber at Richmond Palace became something between a sanctuary and a tomb. Those allowed entry did so with the same reverence reserved for sacred spaces. Ministers, ladies-in-waiting, and physicians moved in hushed steps, speaking only when necessary, their voices lowered not just in respect, but in the heavy anticipation of an ending everyone felt but no one dared name aloud. Elizabeth did not speak. Not a farewell, not a prayer, not a final command. The queen, whose voice had once shaken parliaments and inspired troops, had grown mute. Her silence was not just physical, it was symbolic. She was withdrawing from the world in the most complete way possible, removing herself word by word, gesture by gesture, until all that remained was breath. Those breaths, too, grew faint, shallow, irregular, and yet she lingered. No one could say how much time passed in that dim chamber, only that hours felt like days and days like weeks. The fire in the hearth burned low. Candles were trimmed again and again, and Elizabeth remained, unmoving beneath layers of velvet and linen, her crown resting nearby, untouched. Occasionally her fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttered, but no one could tell if she was aware or already half gone. Her closest attendant, Lady Scrope, never left her side. She dabbed the queen's forehead with rose water and held her hand in silence, knowing that the monarch she had served for decades was slipping away in a manner as quiet and unyielding as she had ruled. Outside the chamber, the palace was locked in a holding pattern. No proclamations were made, no messengers dispatched. Not until the final breath passed would anyone dare speak of death. To do so before was unthinkable. The kingdom still had a queen until it didn't. But inside that still room, something profound was unfolding. This was not merely the passing of a sovereign. This was the death of an era. The Tudor dynasty had been born out of civil war, forged in fire, and tempered through decades of brutal politics and religious strife. Elizabeth had been its final torchbearer, the flame that refused to flicker, even as storm after storm battered her reign. Her life had been filled with spectacle, ceremonies, grand speeches, pageantry, but her death was the opposite. No drama, no divine pronouncements, just silence. Some wondered if she was seeing visions, perhaps flashes of a life she had lived, a childhood marked by danger and isolation. The tower where she had once been imprisoned by her sister, Mary. The triumph at Tilbury, where she addressed troops in armor. The betrayal of Essex. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. A crown she had worn alone for 44 years, unshared by husband or heir. Those who stood vigil saw the changes in her face. The flush of fever faded into pallor. The gentle movement of her chest slowed. Her hands grew colder. Her body, once carefully hidden behind layers of wealth and illusion, was now unmistakably human, bruised, thin, and weary. And yet she clung to life, not out of fear, perhaps, but out of habit, out of the same iron resolve that had carried her through rebellions and wars, that had built her into the Virgin Queen. Death would not take her easily. She would decide the moment. As always, those around her waited. Ministers like Robert Cecil stood ready with documents, plans, and couriers. Everything had been prepared. If Elizabeth named James VI as her successor, a peaceful transition could be orchestrated. If not, the door to chaos remained ajar. The court held its breath, just as the Queen held on to life. And then, in the deep hours of night, something shifted. A stillness even deeper than before crept into the room. Elizabeth no longer responded to light, to sound, to the faint touch of linen against her skin. Her chest rose and fell once more, and then no more. No final words, no dramatic gesture, no declaration, just silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Not Lady Scrope, not the ministers, not the attending physicians. All stood as though the world itself had paused. And then, without fanfare, Lady Scrope stepped forward and drew a linen cloth over the Queen's face. It was done. Elizabeth I was dead. The moment that followed was unlike anything the kingdom had known. For most in England, she had been the only monarch they'd ever known. Her image was etched into coins, printed on proclamations, painted in courtly halls. Her death was not just the loss of a ruler. It was the collapse of a national identity. But even as grief settled over Richmond, a machine long in motion began to turn. Robert Cecil, perhaps the only man in England who truly understood the scale of the moment, moved quickly. His secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland had prepared for this day. Messengers were dispatched before dawn, riding through muddy spring roads toward Edinburgh. Their mission, to inform James that the throne of England was now his. For several hours, the death was kept quiet. No bells tolled, no public mourning declared. It was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was strategy. The court feared unrest, opportunism, foreign plots. England had seen what happened when succession faltered. Civil war, bloodshed, religious terror. The Queen's silence had been powerful, but now it left a dangerous vacuum. Eventually, word leaked. Servants whispered it to one another. Merchants caught fragments of conversation. The clergy heard rumors before the church bells rang. And soon, the news rippled through London and beyond. The Queen was gone. The Virgin Queen, who had refused marriage and ruled alone, had taken her leave with the same solitude she carried through life. Her body remained at Richmond, untouched. Her lady stood vigil, reading psalms softly through tears. A single candle burned beside her bed, illuminating the linen-draped face that had once launched 1,000 portraits. The death was final, but the moment was suspended, fragile, uncertain, profound. As dawn broke, the age of Elizabeth ended. In the quiet hours after Elizabeth I's passing, Richmond Palace became a place suspended between worlds, between the past that had just ended and the future that had not yet begun. The Queen's body lay untouched, wrapped in the solemn silence of those who dared not speak too soon. The tradition was clear. Until formal rites were performed and a successor named, the sovereign still held the throne, even in death. And for a few hours, England had neither a ruling voice nor a public grief. Within the palace walls, the atmosphere thickened with anxiety. Robert Cecil, the Queen's most trusted minister and principal architect of her government stability, knew time was short. The longer England remained without a monarch, the greater the risk of factionalism and unrest. He moved swiftly but cautiously. Every step had to be measured, every whisper of authority carefully grounded. A misstep in these moments could plunge the kingdom into chaos. Yet Cecil had long prepared for this. For years, he had engaged in discreet communication with James VI of Scotland, building a quiet alliance across borders. Though Elizabeth had never publicly declared her successor, Cecil understood the necessity of continuity. James, Protestant and experienced, was the logical choice, though not without complication. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had ordered executed. He had never set foot in England. His claim, though legitimate, was shadowed by history. But the groundwork was laid. Even as Elizabeth lay still in her chamber, Cecil's messengers galloped northward, bearing letters sealed with urgency. They would ride through wind, rain, and mud to reach Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, carrying the words that would change a man into a monarch. Meanwhile, in London, the Privy Council met in hushed tones. The death of a monarch demanded protocol, but also swift, decisive action. By late morning, they made their announcement. James VI of Scotland will become James I of England. A new king, a new dynasty, a peaceful transition from Tudor to Stuart. It was a moment of rare political grace. No swords were drawn. No rival factions rose up. The crown, for all its complications, passed without bloodshed. But if the succession soothed the realm's nerves, it did not lessen the weight of loss. Elizabeth's body remained at Richmond, her chamber darkened, her ladies of the bedchamber refusing to leave her side. They whispered psalms. They wept in silence. The linen cloth that covered her face did not hide her identity. Instead, it preserved it, an image frozen in time, the last glimpse of a queen who had ruled alone and unchallenged for 44 years. To many, it was difficult to imagine the world without her. Elizabeth had been queen for longer than most of her subjects had been alive. Her presence was embedded in the very fabric of English life. She was not merely a ruler. She was a symbol of endurance, of sovereignty, of uniquely English power. The sun had risen and set with her name. Now it would rise without it. Even as the council began making plans for her funeral and transition of power, the practicalities of death took their course. Her body, once hidden beneath layers of silk, jewels, and powdered wigs, began to reveal the toll her reign, and perhaps her cosmetics, had taken. As her ladies prepared her for viewing, They removed the layers of courtly armor and found what had long been hidden: bruising, lesions, pale and mottled skin from decades of exposure to toxic makeup. Her hands, once adorned with rings and symbols of rule, were bony and cold. Her hair, once fiery red beneath the wigs, had turned wispy and gray. Elizabeth had refused to let the public see her like this in life. But in death, there was no more hiding. The mask had fallen, and what remained was not diminished. It was more human, more real. No embalming was done immediately. In Tudor England, tradition dictated a delay before burial, to allow time for national mourning and ceremonial arrangements. So she lay in state, dressed once more in royal robes, crown placed gently above her brow, the orb and scepter arranged beside her. It was a vision of regal dignity, even in death. And the people came. From every corner of the kingdom, nobles, clergy, and commoners arrived in London to pay their respects. The lines stretched long. The silence was deep. Some wept. Others simply stared. It wasn't just grief. They were witnessing the passing of an age. With Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty ended. The lineage that had brought England out of the Wars of the Roses, weathered the Reformation, and led the nation into an age of exploration and cultural rebirth, was no more. And with that ending came uncertainty. What would the future hold under James? Would he rule as wisely? Could he maintain the religious balance Elizabeth had so carefully preserved? Would England's golden age continue or begin to tarnish under new leadership? No one knew. But even as questions loomed, preparations continued. The funeral would not be rushed. It would be worthy of a queen who had reshaped a nation. Until then, her body would remain under watch, her chamber treated as a sacred space, her memory cast in gold. The Virgin Queen had left no heir, no direct bloodline to carry her legacy. What she left instead was myth. And myths, unlike bodies, do not decay. The decision to delay Elizabeth's burial was not due to uncertainty nor neglect, it was reverence. England had never seen a reign quite like hers, and it would never see another monarch exactly the same again. To rush her funeral would have been to diminish her story. Every detail of her final journey was planned with the utmost care, befitting a queen who had crafted her public image with unmatched precision for over 4 decades. Elizabeth I had been more than a political figure. She was a symbol carved into the conscience of a country. Her face had been printed on coins, her speeches memorized by diplomats and poets alike, her wardrobe imitated across the courts of Europe. To bury her was to lay to rest not just a person, but an era, the Elizabethan age itself. This wasn't just a monarch's funeral. It was a nation's farewell to its most enduring identity. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her death, the final procession began. At the heart of London, in the courtyard of Whitehall Palace, her coffin was placed atop a massive hearse drawn by 4 black horses. Draped in deep velvet, the coffin was adorned with emblems of sovereignty. Atop it sat an effigy of the Queen herself, dressed in state robes, wearing a golden crown, orb in one hand, scepter in the other. The face of the effigy was so lifelike that many spectators believed it to be her real body propped upright. The craftsmanship was deliberate. It was one final performance, one last image to be seared into the minds of her people. The Queen, watching, even in death. The streets were lined with thousands. Nobles in solemn black, bishops in embroidered robes, foreign ambassadors bearing the crests of distant courts. They all stood side by side with tradesmen, mothers, and children. All eyes turned toward the carriage. There were no cheers, no horns, no music. Only the low tolling of bells, the sound of hooves on cobblestones, and the rustle of thousands holding their breath. The Queen was coming. From Whitehall, the procession moved slowly through the heart of the capital, heading toward Westminster Abbey. Every corner of the route had been meticulously planned, every turn taken with symbolic precision. It was not merely a movement through space, it was a movement through memory. Past the courts where she had outwitted rivals, past the chambers where she had signed treaties and knelt in prayer, past the homes of those who had loved her, hated her, feared her, and followed her. Behind the hearse marched the honor guard. Behind them, the nobles of her court, dressed in mourning. Members of Parliament walked in solemn formation. Clergy whispered verses under their breath. And further back, the common people followed, quiet, reverent, stunned by the weight of history unfolding before their eyes. At Westminster Abbey, the final ceremony awaited. Elizabeth was interred in a royal vault, laid to rest beside her half-sister and one-time rival, Mary I. It was a choice thick with historical irony. In life, the two queens have been divided by faith and blood, one Catholic, the other Protestant. Mary had imprisoned Elizabeth during the dark days of her reign, and yet, in death, they would lie side by side for eternity. The tomb bears a chillingly poetic inscription, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." The phrase did not go unnoticed. To many historians, it served as both reconciliation and warning, a reminder that even bitter enmity can be softened by time, and that royal legacies are always intertwined in ways that defy clean division. As the doors of the Abbey closed behind the final mourners, something shifted in England. A queen had died, a dynasty had ended, and a new era had begun. Yet Elizabeth's hold on the national imagination didn't wane. If anything, it grew stronger. Her passing had not diminished her. It had elevated her. In the weeks following her burial, poets penned elegies. Artists painted memorial portraits. Courtiers recalled her speeches in perfect detail. Her voice, long silenced, seemed to echo louder through memory than it ever had in life. Even as James I took the throne and the Stuart age dawned, Elizabeth's presence lingered. She remained in the architecture of thought, in the language of power, in the very rhythm of what it meant to be English. Her image appeared in stained glass, her speeches in schoolbooks, her crown in the dreams of every monarch who followed. But none could match her. Elizabeth had ruled alone. She had outlived rivals. She had refused to marry. She had defied every expectation of her gender and station. She had played the game of power with unmatched mastery. And now, even in death, she remained untouched by time. Her silence at the end, so carefully guarded, so profoundly complete, became part of her legend. She had not offered a final speech. She had not named her successor aloud. She had not begged history to remember her. Instead, she had let her reign do the speaking. And it did. It still does. In a time before photography, before audio recordings, before social media, Elizabeth had etched her image into the soul of a nation so deeply that it would never be erased. She had become a myth in her own lifetime. In death, she became something more. In the wake of Elizabeth's funeral, even as James I was declared king and the machinery of monarchy began to turn once more, the question lingered. What had actually caused the death of a queen so formidable, so guarded, so seemingly indestructible? For all the pageantry of her burial, for all the whispered reverence of her final days, there remained an uncomfortable, unanswered mystery. Elizabeth's decline had been slow, quiet, and strange. There had been no dramatic fever, no assassination, no visible wounds. What had finally felled her? Contemporaries had little consensus. Tudor medicine lacked the tools to truly understand internal illness. Without thermometers or germ theory, physicians relied on ancient concepts like the imbalance of humors. They spoke of melancholia, a term that could describe everything from depression to anemia to cancer. Some suggested a cold distemper of the brain. Others speculated that age alone had simply eroded her strength, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. But in the centuries that followed, historians and medical scholars began to revisit the evidence with modern eyes. And what they found was troubling. One of the most persistent theories is that Elizabeth died of pneumonia, a lung infection likely triggered by the cold conditions at Richmond Palace, her refusal to lie down, and her weeks of fasting. The symptoms reported by her attendants match well: a lingering cough, weakness, chills, a slow spiral into delirium. Without antibiotics or modern treatment, even a minor case could have proved fatal. And Elizabeth's frailty in those final weeks made her a prime target for such an illness. Another possibility is blood poisoning, now known as septicemia. Elizabeth had long suffered from poor dental hygiene, common in her time. By the end of her life, many of her teeth were blackened or missing. Infections from abscessed teeth could easily spread into the bloodstream. Combined with her refusal to eat and drink, such an infection could have ravaged her body with little outward sign other than exhaustion, confusion, and eventual organ failure. But perhaps the most chilling theory remains the slow, unrelenting effects of lead poisoning. Venetian ceruse, her trademark white face paint, contained high levels of white lead. Applied daily, this makeup seeped through the skin, accumulating in the bloodstream. Over years and decades, the damage would become irreversible. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a checklist of Elizabeth's final behaviors: tremors, weight loss, fatigue, irritability, cognitive decline, hair loss, skin lesions. Even her sudden aversion to music and conversation aligns with the psychological impacts of prolonged exposure to toxic metals. Elizabeth had been using Venetian ceruse for decades. To maintain the appearance of eternal youth, she had built her entire image on the illusion of ageless perfection. Every morning, her attendants would layer it over her face, concealing blemishes, aging, illness, everything. It was more than makeup. It was identity. It was power. But it may also have been the very thing that killed her. Modern historians point to these physical signs: her thinning hair hidden by wigs, her deteriorating skin masked by powder, her increasingly erratic behavior, as proof of lead's corrosive effect. And in a final irony, the same compound that had built her image as the Virgin Queen may have slowly destroyed her body from within. There are, of course, more speculative theories. Some have suggested cancer, perhaps ovarian or uterine, which could explain her weight loss and pain. Others hint at a kind of psychological breakdown, that her grief over Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, became a depression so deep it led to a kind of passive suicide. She refused food. She refused sleep. She refused comfort. She simply faded. And there's truth in that image. Elizabeth's sorrow after Essex's execution was more than visible. He had betrayed her, raised arms against the crown, but she had loved him in whatever way she allowed herself to love. His death marked something permanent. Witnesses said she never recovered, that her appetite disappeared, that her laughter ceased, that she became a ghost of her former self. Some say she muttered his name in the dark. Others claim she carried a miniature of his portrait in a locket worn close to her heart. Whether those tales are romantic exaggerations or honest observations, the transformation was undeniable. From that moment forward, the Queen grew quieter, more reclusive, less willing to engage with the world she once commanded so fiercely. Depression, in our modern understanding, can have a devastating impact on the immune system and physical health. Elizabeth's refusal to eat, sleep, or move may have been the physical manifestation of an emotional collapse, a surrender not to death itself, but to the grief that preceded it. In truth, no single cause likely explains her death. More probable is a convergence: age, grief, illness, vanity, pride, and poison, each thread weaving into the fabric of her final decline. The weight of her crown, carried for more than 40 years without rest, finally became too much. And with no one to share it, she allowed it to slip quietly from her shoulders. And still, no confession was made, no explanation offered. Even in death, Elizabeth refused clarity. Her body spoke in signs, her silence in riddles. This was consistent with how she had lived. The queen of ambiguity, the master of appearances, the monarch who gave England peace and poetry while veiling her own life in mystery. That final silence became her last act of sovereignty. She would not let the world define her death. She had defined everything else: her reign, her image, her myth. Why should the end be any different? And so she left no answers, only questions. Elizabeth's silence at the end of her life was more than a personal quirk or a symptom of illness. It was a final assertion of control by a monarch who had spent her reign mastering the art of ambiguity. For over 4 decades, she had wielded uncertainty like a sword, evading marriage, avoiding declarations, refusing to name an heir, and turning questions into strategies. Her silence had been a tool, a veil, a shield, and in her final days, it became a fortress. But for those left behind, that silence posed a serious problem. Without an official declaration from the Queen, there was no irrefutable statement of succession. The assumption was that James VI of Scotland would take the throne. He was Protestant, well-educated, and descended through Margaret Tudor, Elizabeth's aunt. But assumptions did not equate to law. In a kingdom still haunted by the Wars of the Roses, any vacuum of authority could invite civil war, rival claims, or foreign meddling. It fell to the Privy Council, and in particular to Robert Cecil, to interpret the Queen's silence as consent. There were whispers that she had gestured approval for James in her final days. A faint nod, a hand motion toward his portrait, a quiet acceptance whispered to a confidant. But none of these were official. None bore the weight of the Queen's seal or voice. And yet, in the name of continuity and national stability, they would have to suffice. Cecil moved quickly and decisively. The groundwork had been laid years earlier. Secret correspondences with James, written in cipher, had assured the Scottish king of Cecil's support. The Queen had likely been aware, though characteristically, she had never explicitly endorsed the arrangement. She had preferred to remain above the politics of succession, even as it loomed closer with each passing year. Still, when the time came, her machinery of governance did not falter. Within hours of her death, the council met and agreed unanimously to proclaim James VI as James I of England. The decision was publicized with careful solemnity. Messengers on horseback rode in every direction, spreading the news. The transition, though born of uncertain roots, unfolded with surprising smoothness. In Edinburgh, James received the message with composed urgency. He had waited for this moment all his life. As the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, a queen executed by Elizabeth herself, his relationship with England had always been fraught with history and peril. But he was smart, patient, and well-prepared. When word reached him, he set out southward with deliberate speed, knowing that the eyes of 2 kingdoms were upon him. Back in England, preparations for his arrival began even as the court remained in mourning. The juxtaposition was striking. On one hand, the nation was burying its longest reigning monarch. On the other, it was preparing to receive a new king. It was a pivot that required grace and careful orchestration, lest the moment seem callous or disjointed. But Elizabeth's legacy loomed over the transition like a shadow. Though she was gone, her presence still filled every corridor, every council chamber, every thought. The way she had ruled, alone, powerful, inscrutable, set a standard that would haunt her successor for years. James might inherit her throne, but he could never inherit her myth. And what a myth it was! Elizabeth had ruled as the Virgin Queen, a title both political and symbolic. She had refused marriage, refused to tie her fate to a man, and instead married the kingdom itself. Her reign had been defined by elaborate performances of power and purity. She had worn white to symbolize virginity, painted her face in ghostly pale, lead to appear timeless, and surrounded herself with poets, painters, and musicians who helped craft an image that was as divine as it was human. But behind that image was a woman of remarkable intelligence and strategic depth. Elizabeth's avoidance of marriage wasn't merely romantic idealism. It was political genius. Marriage, in her era, meant entanglement. It meant sharing power. It meant choosing between domestic factions or foreign alliances. Any marriage would have alienated someone. By staying single, Elizabeth retained absolute authority, positioned herself as England's mother and bride, and kept foreign powers guessing. She also used courtship as diplomacy. Suitors were entertained, but never chosen. Proposals were discussed, but never accepted. This kept England relevant in the eyes of Europe and prevented other monarchs from viewing her kingdom as hostile. In an age of dynastic politics, Elizabeth's singleness was not weakness, it was armor. And it worked. Her court became the center of an English Renaissance. Writers like Shakespeare and Marlowe thrived under her patronage. Explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh expanded English influence across the seas. Her navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, securing Protestant England's survival and asserting its growing might on the global stage. But all of that made her decline even more tragic. The woman who had once stood before armies in armor, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king, spent her final weeks hunched in silence, refusing even to lie down. Her grip on the throne had been iron, until her body simply gave out beneath the weight of history. In many ways, her death was a paradox. It was quiet, unceremonious, hidden from the world. But its aftermath was monumental. A Protestant queen who had ruled as a divine figure died without a word. And in doing so, she left behind a silence that echoed louder than any speech she had ever given. This silence became a canvas onto which the nation projected its own meaning. Some saw it as stoic, others as tragic. Some interpreted it as a final act of control, others as the ultimate surrender. But in all cases, it was Elizabeth's final decision, an act of power cloaked in stillness. She had ruled England without sharing her crown. She had died without naming her heir. And yet, she had held the kingdom together longer and more effectively than any monarch before her. In the days following her burial, poets began to write about her not just as a queen, but as an immortal figure, a guardian of England, a goddess in velvet. And while the world turned, while James I assumed power, while new policies were drafted and new faces filled the court, her image remained frozen, not fading, enduring. As James VI of Scotland entered England to be crowned James I, the first monarch of both England and Scotland under a single crown, he stepped into a realm still draped in the shadows of his predecessor. Elizabeth had not simply vacated a throne. She had left behind a legacy that clung to every part of English identity. The people might accept their new king, but they could not yet let go of their queen. The transition of power was smooth on paper. There was no civil unrest, no war of succession, no competing claimants rising in rebellion. But emotionally and symbolically, the kingdom was still frozen in the long shadow cast by Elizabeth's reign. James was welcomed formally, with proper deference and polite celebration. But there was no eruption of joy, no spontaneous outpouring of national relief or excitement. The tone was more cautious, subdued, watchful. People wondered what kind of king he would be, and whether he could possibly live up to the woman who had ruled them for so long. The political establishment, too, had to adjust quickly. James brought with him an entourage of Scottish advisors, courtiers, and customs, many of which clashed with English expectations. While he was well-educated and intellectually formidable, James's personality differed sharply from Elizabeth's. He was bookish, prone to rambling speeches, and socially awkward in ways Elizabeth had never been. Where Elizabeth dazzled with charisma and theatrical flair, James preferred scholarly debate and theological discourse. Still, he was pragmatic. He moved quickly to reassure his new subjects, confirming the Church of England's Protestant identity and promising continuity rather than revolution. He understood that the best way to begin his reign was not by rewriting Elizabeth's legacy, but by paying homage to it. He ordered sermons in her honor, allowed her portraits to remain displayed in palaces and town halls, and even adopted some of her language when addressing Parliament. Yet despite these gestures, the contrast was unavoidable. Elizabeth had ruled alone, without a husband or children, embodying England's identity as a singular, self-reliant power. James, by contrast, came with a family, a queen consort, and of Denmark, and children including Henry, Elizabeth, and Charles. His dynasty was visible, tangible, and more traditional. This was a shift. The Tudor mystique of the lone sovereign was giving way to the familiar structure of royal succession. And not everyone welcomed the change. Among the nobility and court officials who had flourished under Elizabeth's favor, there was a quiet mourning not just for the queen, but for the world she had built. Her court had been a place of art, poetry, and calculated flirtation. James's court was more rigid, more concerned with hierarchy and religious conformity. Some poets and playwrights, most famously William Shakespeare, began to subtly adapt their work to reflect the new monarch, but echoes of Elizabeth's era still lingered in their language and imagery. One notable shift came in how Elizabeth was remembered, and how quickly that memory began to harden into legend. Even during her life, Elizabeth had cultivated a myth around herself. The Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the divine monarch whose wisdom and purity guided England through storm and war. After her death, this image grew more elaborate. Historians, clergymen, and playwrights began to portray her not just as a successful ruler, but as a saint-like figure who had preserved the nation's soul. Her faults were softened. Her political hesitations transformed into strategic genius. Her vanity became symbolism. Her silence in death became majestic. This process of mythologizing was not unique to Elizabeth. Many monarchs are lionized after death, but in her case, the intensity and speed of the transformation were striking. Within a decade of her death, the narrative of the golden age of Elizabeth had taken hold. It was taught in schools. It shaped sermons. It colored the way future generations viewed not only her reign, but the entire Tudor era. This was especially ironic given how much of her life had been spent battling for legitimacy. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate as a child. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed for treason and adultery. Her sister Mary had imprisoned her. Male courtiers and foreign rulers had dismissed her as weak or unfit. And yet she had not only ruled, she had thrived. Her success had redefined what was possible for a female monarch in a patriarchal world. Now, in death, all the doubts that had once surrounded her were erased. She had become untouchable. Even James, her successor, had to contend with her ghost, not literally, but politically and emotionally. Every policy he introduced, every shift he made, was measured against the standard Elizabeth had set. She had become the eternal yardstick of English monarchy. And this posed a challenge. For while Elizabeth had left behind no heir, she had left behind expectations. Expectations about what a monarch should be, how they should speak, behave, rule. James could never match her mystique, nor did he try. He focused instead on uniting his two kingdoms, pushing for what he called a Great Britain, though the term was more symbolic than legal at the time. He leaned into theology and governance, leaving the art of illusion to history. But the public didn't forget. They remembered the queen who had walked among them during progressions through the countryside. They remembered her Tilbury speech, rallying troops against the Spanish Armada. They remembered the portraits of her in shimmering white gowns, surrounded by symbols of empire and virtue. These weren't just memories, they were icons. And those icons began to serve a political purpose. During James's reign, as tensions between monarch and parliament began to simmer, some political thinkers began invoking Elizabeth as a model of proper monarchy. They claimed she had ruled with a balance of firmness and restraint, that she had respected the ancient liberties of Englishmen. Whether or not that was true, it became useful. Her legacy became a tool, not just for nostalgia, but for argument. Elizabeth, even in death, remained politically active, not through laws or proclamations, but through memory, through myth. She was no longer merely a queen. She was a symbol. As James I settled into the English throne, the influence of Elizabeth I did not dissipate. It calcified. Her memory became something more potent than mere nostalgia. It became the foundation upon which the Stuart monarchy was both legitimized and compared, a double-edged legacy that both shielded James and judged him at every turn. The people had not just lost a monarch, they had lost an era, and they weren't ready to forget. Elizabeth's reign had crafted a golden narrative of English greatness. She had overseen victories over the Spanish Armada, fostered the arts, and presided over a period of national pride and religious stability. Even her flaws had become virtues in the public mind. Her refusal to marry, a sign of independence. Her paranoia, a mark of political foresight. Her elaborate self-presentation, a form of sacred theater. All of this created a standard that no successor could easily meet. James, despite his qualifications, bore the burden of that comparison. And while he made some early efforts to honor Elizabeth's legacy, tensions soon emerged. His attempts to forge a stronger union between England and Scotland were met with resistance. His belief in the divine right of kings clashed with the English Parliament's growing sense of its own authority. Unlike Elizabeth, who skillfully played factions against each other to maintain power, James often alienated key groups by speaking too freely, favoring Scottish courtiers, and overestimating the patience of his subjects. The contrast was stark. Elizabeth had been theatrical, enigmatic, and disciplined in her public appearances. James was verbose, overly familiar, and sometimes unguarded. Where she had mastered the symbolism of monarchy, he often undermined it through informality. She had been the myth, he was the man. This difference mattered, because by this point, Elizabeth's image was no longer hers alone. It had been seized by the public, shaped by writers, sermonized by clergy, and enshrined by artists. Her portraits hung in town halls long after her death. Her speeches were quoted in Parliament. Her name appeared in pamphlets and political tracts as a model of what monarchy should look like. She was no longer just Gloriana. She was a measuring stick, a weapon in ideological arguments, a reminder of what the people believed they had lost. That idealized version of Elizabeth was largely a posthumous invention. During her reign, she had made mistakes, faced criticism, and navigated more than her share of crises. But death had smoothed those edges. What remained was the legend. And in that legend, the Virgin Queen had become eternal. This idealization also gave rise to public rituals of remembrance. Every year on November 17th, the anniversary of Elizabeth's accession to the throne, bells rang across England in what came to be known as Queen Elizabeth's Day. It was not a formal holiday, but it carried powerful symbolic weight. Bonfires were lit, sermons were delivered, speeches were made recalling the glory of her reign. These ceremonies were as much about the present as the past. They served as subtle critiques of the current monarchy by elevating the previous one. And the monarchy felt it. James tolerated these commemorations at first, understanding their emotional significance. But as his own popularity waned and political tensions deepened, the constant invocation of Elizabeth began to irritate his court. In 1611, he issued a directive discouraging public celebrations of Queen Elizabeth's Day, citing the need to focus on the living monarch, not the dead. The order had little effect. People lit the bonfires anyway. Clergymen preached her virtues from the pulpit. Even some members of Parliament continued to reference her reign in debates. The Elizabethan myth could not be silenced. It had become part of England's political vocabulary. It's worth noting that this kind of posthumous veneration is rare in English history. While other monarchs were remembered fondly or praised in retrospect, few achieved the status of secular saint the way Elizabeth did. Her image was used by Protestants to defend their cause. Her speeches were invoked by advocates of parliamentary power. Her memory comforted those who feared the rising tensions between monarchy and the governed. Elizabeth had become not only the queen of her time, but a queen for all time. And her image continued to evolve. Artists in the decades after her death painted her in increasingly symbolic ways. She was depicted with celestial globes, phoenixes, and pearls, symbols of purity, eternity, and resurrection. In some paintings, she seemed more goddess than woman. Her face was idealized, her features smooth, her expression serene. These were not accurate likenesses. They were icons, visual hymns to a reign that had become more spiritual than political. The transformation of Elizabeth into a kind of national divinity culminated in literary works that canonized her legacy. Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen, though written during her lifetime, gained renewed popularity after her death. In it, Elizabeth appears as Gloriana, the embodiment of virtue and power. Later poets and playwrights echoed these themes, casting her in roles that blurred the lines between history, mythology, and prophecy. Even Shakespeare, whose career had spanned the last decades of her reign, left subtle traces of Elizabethan influence in his later plays. Some scholars see Queen Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream or Queen Hermione in The Winter's Tale as reflections of Elizabeth's enduring power and tragedy. Whether intentional or not, the aura of Elizabeth persisted in the language of the stage. The persistence of this myth would have consequences. By the time of the English Civil War, Elizabeth's reign was remembered as a golden age of unity, prosperity, and balance between monarch and parliament. Royalists and parliamentarians alike invoked her image to support their claims. She was, in effect, politically resurrected, used as both example and counterexample, depending on who was doing the remembering. That's the paradox of legacy. The dead no longer control their image. Others do. And Elizabeth, perhaps more than any English monarch, became a canvas for her people's hopes, fears, and grievances. She had ruled in life by mastering the art of appearances. In death, she was ruled by the interpretations of those she had once governed. As the years turned into decades, and the Tudor period became the subject of memory rather than living experience, the image of Elizabeth I only grew more colossal. She had long since passed into the realm of political mythology, but now she began to occupy something even broader, a cultural archetype. She was no longer just England's queen. She was England itself, frozen in a moment of supposed perfection. And as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, her name was invoked not only in parliaments and pulpits, but in popular imagination, poetry, and even empire building. This transformation didn't occur in a vacuum. The turbulence that followed her death, James I's awkward integration into English politics, the rise and fall of Charles I, the Civil War, the brief but seismic existence of the Commonwealth under Cromwell, had left the nation in search of stability. In that chaos, the memory of Elizabeth I was recalled again and again as a golden anchor. She was a figure from a time when England had supposedly been united, strong, and blessed by divine fortune. Whether or not that was the whole truth mattered less than the power of the idea. This is one of the peculiar traits of posthumous reputation. It simplifies. It refines. It creates a symbol so durable that the human complexities beneath it disappear. By the early 1700s, Elizabeth was being presented in schools as a moral exemplar. Her letters were printed as models of eloquent English. Her speeches, particularly the famous address at Tilbury, were included in rhetorical textbooks. Her image was not just used to teach history, but to teach virtue. She was the wise ruler, the chaste sovereign, the warrior queen. The Elizabeth that students learned about bore little resemblance to the flesh and blood woman who had ruled amid intrigue, fear, compromise, and political gamesmanship. Yet this sanitized version had immense power. And it wasn't just in England. Across the expanding British Empire, Elizabeth's name carried symbolic weight. Colonists and merchants looked back to her era as the root of English greatness. Her support of early explorers, like Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe, and Walter Raleigh, who laid the groundwork for English colonization in the Americas, was now remembered as the beginning of a civilizing mission, rather than the tangled web of piracy, exploitation, and ambition that it had actually been. In Virginia, the first successful English colony, they even named the region in her honor. Virginia was a tribute to the Virgin Queen, a sign of how deeply her image had become tied to expansionist identity. Even long after her death, Elizabeth was being used to lend legitimacy to new worlds. Meanwhile, back home, her image was still evolving. In visual art, Elizabeth became even more stylized. Engravings and paintings produced in the 18th and 19th centuries bore little resemblance to the woman as she appeared in her actual portraits. Artists emphasized her slender frame, porcelain skin, and dignified poise, stripping away the traces of age, vanity, and bodily decay. In these later depictions, she never grew old. She was eternally regal, an immortal queen presiding over an imaginary England unspoiled by civil strife or political dissent. This idealization intensified in the Victorian era. Queen Victoria, who would later surpass Elizabeth as the longest-reigning British monarch, saw in Elizabeth both a rival and a role model. Victoria admired Elizabeth's independence and strength, even as she quietly disapproved of her unmarried status. Public commentators often compared the two. One ruled as a wife and mother, the other as a solitary sovereign. The comparisons fueled both celebration and tension, depending on one's political perspective. But what remained constant was the reverence. Elizabeth was no longer just a historical figure. She was part of Britain's national mythology. In literature, she continued to reappear, especially in works that sought to grapple with national identity. In the 19th century, poets like Alfred, Lord Tennyson, and dramatists like Thomas Babington Macaulay wrote of her reign in reverent, almost religious terms. She was seen as the embodiment of Protestant virtue, a shield against Catholic tyranny, and a maternal figure who had preserved English liberty. The fact that she had done so as a woman only added to the mystique. In an age still deeply skeptical of female power, Elizabeth was the exception that proved the rule and simultaneously subverted it. The contradictions only added to her power. She had ruled like a man, but remained a woman. She had embraced virginity, but understood seduction. She had protected national sovereignty, yet manipulated international diplomacy with unmatched finesse. She had avoided war when possible, but stood resolute when necessary. She was both hard and soft, fierce and prudent, calculating and compassionate. This ambiguity made her irresistible to storytellers. Throughout the 20th century, Elizabeth became a staple in film, television, and fiction. She was portrayed by dozens of actresses, each emphasizing a different aspect of her character. Some focused on her youth, highlighting her vulnerability as a girl who survived the violent politics of the Tudor court. Others portrayed her in her prime, brilliant, commanding, and almost divine in her authority. And still others zeroed in on her old age, bitter, isolated, and exhausted from the burden of rule. The more she was portrayed, the more elastic her image became. In some depictions, she was a feminist icon, a woman who rose above patriarchy and forged her own destiny. In others, she was a tragic figure, lonely, paranoid, and consumed by the very power she had sought to master. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. But the power of her story lay in its multiplicity. Elizabeth could be anything to anyone, a heroine, a martyr, a tyrant, a saint. This is perhaps the final evolution of her myth. Not just that she became legendary, but that she became flexible, endlessly adaptable to new contexts and new needs. Whether the British Empire needed a founding mother, or feminist scholars sought a symbol of female leadership, or popular culture demanded a dramatic queen for the screen, Elizabeth was ready. Or rather, her image was, and all the while, the silence of her final days remained. She never wrote a farewell letter, never made a final declaration, never named a successor aloud. In death, she left only shadows, and into those shadows, centuries of historians, artists, and politicians poured meaning. That is her paradox. She ruled by controlling appearances, and in death, she lost control of the greatest appearance of all, her legacy. The 20th century brought Elizabeth I fully into the age of mass media. With the advent of film, television, and later the internet, her image ceased to be the property of dusty textbooks or oil paintings hanging in old halls. Now, she was everywhere, her likeness flickering on movie screens, her name invoked in classrooms and commentaries, her speeches dramatized for new generations. But this new immortality came with its own transformations. In cinema, Elizabeth was portrayed by a wide range of actresses, each interpretation colored by the values and cultural concerns of their time. Bette Davis, in the 1939 film The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, played her as a powerful but vulnerable ruler torn between duty and desire. In the 1998 film Elizabeth, Cate Blanchett brought a younger, more politically shrewd queen to life, an insecure, thoughtful woman hardened by betrayal, who ultimately chooses her crown over love. In both portrayals, the essence of Elizabeth was retained: power, isolation, and a ruthless dedication to rule. What stood out in these and later adaptations was not merely her story, but how it was used to speak to contemporary audiences. The idea of a woman navigating power in a male-dominated world resonated with feminist themes. The personal sacrifices she made, forsaking love, family, and peace of mind, were portrayed not as tragic flaws, but as marks of heroism. Elizabeth was reimagined again and again as a symbol of female strength, autonomy, and intellect. Yet for all this modern acclaim, there remained historical tensions. The Elizabeth who ruled in the 16th century was not a modern liberal figure. She ruled with absolute authority, used the Secret Service to crush dissent, and ordered executions when deemed politically necessary. She was shrewd in her religious policies, balancing tolerance and repression in a way that minimized civil war but allowed no room for serious opposition. Her treatment of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, fellow monarch, and Catholic rival, was a point of particular historical debate. Mary's execution in 1587, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, was a moment Elizabeth reportedly agonized over. She delayed signing the death warrant. She wept. She blamed her ministers when it was carried out. And yet it was done. Elizabeth had removed her most potent domestic threat, a move that ensured her survival and the stability of Protestant England. But it came at a moral cost that still stirs debate among historians. These complexities are often smoothed over in popular portrayals. In film and fiction, Elizabeth is allowed to be more emotionally open than she likely was in life. She's given teary soliloquies, romantic entanglements, and dramatic confrontations, tools of modern storytelling that help audiences connect, but which don't always align with the historical record. Still, the essence remains: a woman who rose through impossible odds, ruled without a king, and left behind a transformed nation. In academic circles, Elizabeth continued to receive intense scrutiny. Biographers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries tried to reconcile the layers of her myth with the documentary record. Scholars like in Somerset, Alison Weir, and John Guy dug into primary sources, re-examined her correspondence, and compared contemporary accounts of her court. What emerged was not a demolition of her legend, but a refinement. A clearer picture of the political strategies she used, the dangers she faced, and the emotional toll of her reign. They revealed a queen who was not simply clever, but constantly calculating. One who kept courtiers in competition with one another to preserve her own dominance. One who understood that power was not just enforced through laws, but performed daily, through dress, through ritual, through control of narrative. Elizabeth's famous gowns, her wigs, her jewelry, they weren't vanity. They were instruments of power. She used them to defy age, to mask illness, and to create an illusion of divine authority. And the people believed it. Even her closest advisors treated her with a reverence that bordered on religious. She demanded it, and she received it. This theatricality is one reason her legend has endured. Elizabeth understood, perhaps better than any monarch before her, that image is power, and that lesson resonates deeply in an era defined by media. In a world where perception shapes politics, Elizabeth's reign reads like a blueprint. But despite the admiration, some critics have sought to deconstruct the golden image. Feminist scholars have questioned whether the celebration of her virginity was empowering or restrictive, whether it upheld patriarchal values even as it defied them. Post-colonial critics have highlighted how her reign marked the beginning of English imperialism, noting that figures like Raleigh and Drake, lionized in her time, engaged in conquest and slavery that would later fuel the British Empire's darker legacies. Even her religious legacy is more complex than it first appears. While Elizabeth is praised for restoring Protestantism and avoiding large-scale religious wars, her regime was not free from persecution. Catholic priests were executed as traitors. Recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, were fined heavily and sometimes imprisoned. Religious tolerance, in Elizabeth's time, had limits, and she enforced them when she felt the stability of the state was at risk. Still, few monarchs in history have managed to walk the tightrope she did. She maintained internal peace in an age when Europe was racked by religious conflict. She ruled with intelligence in a time when few women held real power. She turned personal disadvantage into political advantage, using the very doubts about her gender and legitimacy as tools to consolidate strength. It's this balancing act that continues to fascinate historians and dramatists alike. Elizabeth was not easily categorized. She was not merely good or bad, strong or vulnerable. She was layered, contradictory, human. And yet, through sheer will and strategic genius, she made herself unforgettable. Centuries later, her image still inspires. Her story is still retold, and her silence, in those final days at Richmond Palace, still resonates. It's the quiet that makes the legend echo louder. Not because it tells us what happened, but because it lets us decide what she meant. As the centuries rolled onward, the question of Elizabeth's meaning, what she stood for, what she symbolized, grew increasingly complex. The bare facts of her reign remained the same. 44 years on the throne, England's defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English literature and drama, a careful balancing of religious factions, and a strategic refusal to marry that redefined sovereign authority. But those facts were now cloaked in layers of interpretation, each shaped by the time in which they were retold. In the early modern period, Elizabeth's legacy had been used to legitimize Protestant England, to celebrate monarchical authority, and to praise the so-called English genius for order and strength. In the Victorian era, she became a point of national pride, an imperial ancestor to Queen Victoria, and a rallying figure for the values of restraint, discipline, and decorum. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new frameworks emerged, ones that looked deeper into gender, politics, and identity. Feminist historians and scholars began to reassess Elizabeth's reign not simply in terms of its achievements, but in terms of its groundbreaking model of female power. Here was a woman who, in an era that viewed female rule as dangerous or unnatural, had not only held power, but had redefined its very image. Elizabeth had weaponized the assumptions of her time. She turned her perceived vulnerabilities, her virginity, her gender, her lack of heirs, into pillars of strength. She did not apologize for being a woman. She made it central to her brand. And yet, she refused to be defined by femininity in the way her society expected. She played the queen as if it were a role, using theatricality, spectacle, and image to sustain control. Her speeches often blurred the line between genders. At Tilbury, she famously declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It was a performance, but a potent one. It allowed her to inhabit both roles, mother of the nation and iron sovereign. For women in later centuries navigating leadership in patriarchal structures, Elizabeth became a model of how to wield authority without surrendering identity. But she was also a warning. Her life was lonely. Her refusal to marry left her without a private companion. Her court was full of intrigue, betrayal, and the constant performance of power. The price of sovereignty was solitude, and that solitude deepened with age, particularly after the death of Essex, the man many believed was her final emotional anchor. Queer theorists have also found complexity in Elizabeth's public identity. Her refusal to marry, her deep emotional attachments to female courtiers, her theatrical self-fashioning, all invite questions that go beyond simple categories of heterosexuality or celibacy. We cannot know her inner life. She left no diaries, no confessions, but her very resistance to conventional romantic roles creates space for reinterpretation. She exists outside the molds that history usually offers women. And in doing so, she continues to be claimed by those searching for alternate narratives of identity and power. Even the materials Elizabeth left behind, her portraits, her speeches, her letters, serve more as artifacts of image management than windows into her soul. Unlike Henry VIII, whose bombastic personality and endless marriages left a trail of personal drama, Elizabeth remains elusive. Her correspondence was precise and diplomatic. Her speeches were calculated. Her portraits were allegorical. We can trace her actions. We can study her words. But the person behind a mask is harder to see, and that may have been her design. Elizabeth understood something fundamental about leadership. Perception matters. She knew the danger of being too familiar, too human. So she remained slightly removed. Even her closest courtiers rarely glimpsed her unadorned. She demanded loyalty, but kept a distance. Her private chambers were carefully guarded, and even when her health declined, she denied entry to all but the most trusted attendants. The mystery was part of the power. That power extended into symbols she curated with relentless precision. The crescent moon, the pelican, the phoenix, these all appeared in her portraits, each chosen for specific meanings. The crescent moon represented chastity and virginity. The pelican, who was believed to pierce its own breast to feed its young, symbolized self-sacrifice and motherhood. The phoenix was rebirth and immortality, a creature that dies in flame only to rise again from its own ashes. Elizabeth used these symbols to write her story without words. She was telling England that she belonged to it entirely, that she gave of herself endlessly, and that her power was not subject to the usual decay of mortal rulers. Whether her subjects fully believed this mattered less than the fact that they were made to see it. And they did. The portrait known as the Rainbow Portrait, painted near the end of her life, is perhaps the most striking example. Elizabeth is depicted with eyes and ears embroidered into her robe, suggesting she sees and hears all. In her hand, she holds a rainbow, symbolizing peace after the storm, with the Latin inscription non sign sol iris, no rainbow without the sun. The sun, of course, is Elizabeth. She is the source of harmony, the necessary light after turmoil. This wasn't modesty. It was divine branding. And it worked. Even after her death, Elizabeth's courtly image retained influence in England's cultural and political imagination. Monarchs and politicians invoked her name to legitimize their causes. Authors and artists used her as a touchstone for greatness. Educators taught her reign as the pinnacle of English civility and stability. But as new generations looked back, some began to question the completeness of the story. Was it really a golden age? For whom? Under Elizabeth, there was relative religious peace, but also censorship, persecution, and execution of dissidents. There was cultural brilliance, but also growing poverty and regional inequality. There was imperial ambition, but at the cost of indigenous lives and the roots of colonial exploitation. These contradictions do not erase her achievements, but they deepen them. They make her real. Elizabeth was a master strategist, a cultural architect, a woman who bent history to her will. But she was also a product of her time, limited by the fears, structures, and expectations of the 16th century. That she rose so far within those limits is extraordinary. That she continues to define the idea of English monarchy centuries later is unprecedented. She is the enigma who became a standard, the silence that grew louder than any speech. The longer Elizabeth's legacy lingered, the more its meanings evolved and fractured. No single narrative could contain her. She was claimed by monarchists as the paragon of royal authority, by feminists as an icon of female leadership, by Protestants as a divine protector of the faith, and by nationalists as the mother of England's greatness. Her myth was universal, yet often contradictory, shaped to fit the needs of each new generation. This flexibility wasn't accidental. It was a byproduct of how she ruled. Elizabeth crafted herself as a symbol. Unlike most rulers who were defined by their policies, Elizabeth was defined by her presence. That presence was cultivated, curated, and constantly reimagined throughout her life. She allowed herself to become a mirror in which her people saw what they needed: strength, purity, divine favor, wisdom, restraint. The real woman behind the icon was shielded by layers of costume, language, and legend. Even in her own lifetime, there were multiple Elizabeths. To the Protestant clergy, she was the defender of the true faith. To poets and courtiers, she was the living embodiment of beauty and virtue. To foreign ambassadors, she was a political chess master, calculating every move with cold precision. To her subjects in the countryside, she was an almost mythical presence, a monarch they might never see, but whose name carried weight in every prayer and proclamation. What's striking is how effectively Elizabeth sustained all these images at once. Her speeches were tailored for each audience. In Parliament, she spoke of humility and service. In times of military threat, she summoned martial strength and national pride. Before her people, she presented warmth, grace, and dedication. And behind closed doors, she navigated the treacherous world of court politics with ruthless clarity. She kept advisors in competition with one another, rotated favorites to avoid overdependence, and refused to name an heir even as age crept in. That last choice, her refusal to designate a successor, was perhaps her boldest and most dangerous move. It left England in a state of suspense that outlasted her. And yet, despite the risks, it preserved her power until the very end. To name a successor would have been to hasten her own irrelevance. Elizabeth would not permit it. She ruled alone, and no future could be acknowledged while she still breathed. But in death, the successor came. James I ascended without formal resistance, and the Tudor line quietly ended. Yet even as the political apparatus moved on, the image of Elizabeth remained. For decades, her portraits hung undisturbed in royal palaces, as if to remind her successors of the standard they must match. In state rituals, her words were still quoted. In popular imagination, her reign was recast as a time of perfect order, a neat narrative of golden peace and national confidence. That narrative, though powerful, concealed as much as it revealed. The Elizabethan era was not without tension or contradiction. Religious conformity was enforced through coercion. Government surveillance increased under Walsingham's spy network. Censorship was widespread. Poverty grew in urban centers. The country's legal and financial institutions were under strain. And the court, though a center of art and music, was also a place of suspicion, manipulation, and whispered betrayals. Even Elizabeth's most celebrated moment, her victory over the Spanish Armada, was less decisive than often remembered. While the English Navy, aided by poor weather, did repel the invasion, Spain remained a formidable power. The war dragged on for years afterward, costing England dearly. But the way the event was narrated at the time, and especially afterward, turned it into a defining victory. One moment of divine deliverance, one speech at Tilbury, one storm sent by God. It didn't matter that reality was more complex. What mattered was the story. And no one understood the power of story better than Elizabeth. She shaped her reign not just through policy, but through symbolism. Her portraits were loaded with meaning. Globes beneath her hand to signify imperial reach, eyes and ears sewn into her dresses to suggest omnipresence, jewels and colors selected for theological resonance. Everything was staged. Everything was deliberate. She controlled access to her person, appearing before the public only when it served her. She carefully timed her progresses through the country, allowing ordinary people to see her and renew their loyalty. These journeys were not leisurely tours. They were political acts, reinforcing the bond between monarch and subject. Wherever she went, she was greeted with pageants, poetry, and loyal declarations. And she responded in kind, with gestures, gifts, and carefully chosen words. This was not vanity. It was statecraft. Elizabeth's reign was built on performance, not in the sense of falseness, but in the understanding that power must be seen to be believed. Her refusal to marry, her elaborate court rituals, her poetic correspondence, they were all part of a broader strategy. She turned herself into a living emblem of national unity at a time when that unity was fragile, and the people believed in it. They believed because they wanted to, because the alternative, another civil war, another religious purge, another foreign entanglement, was too dreadful to contemplate. Elizabeth's myth offered comfort, even when reality was more unstable. She stood at the center of a storm and made it look like a calm. It's this emotional resonance that has allowed her story to endure. It's not just that she ruled well. It's that she ruled in a way that left a mark on the soul of a nation. She embodied the idea of England at a time when the country was still trying to define itself. And by the time of her death, she had become inseparable from that identity. Her silence in the final days did not break the spell. If anything, it deepened it. By refusing to name a successor, by leaving no last testament, she created a vacuum that could be filled only with imagination. And into that space flowed centuries of reverence, reinvention, and remembrance. Elizabeth became the queen who would not end. As England marched through the centuries, reshaped by industrial revolutions, empire, and the rise of democracy, the memory of Elizabeth I remained surprisingly undisturbed. In a world constantly changing, she served as a fixed point, a figure from the past who symbolized continuity, strength, and a kind of pristine Englishness untouched by modern corrosion. And with each new era, her image was revised but never erased. By the 19th century, this reverence had been woven into the very fabric of British nationalism. At a time when the British Empire was expanding across the globe, Elizabeth's reign was retroactively cast as its spiritual origin. Her support for explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, once seen as adventurous and dangerous, was now interpreted as visionary. The colonial exploits of her courtiers were painted not in the colors of ambition and piracy, but in those of destiny and civilizing mission. School children in Victorian classrooms learned about her as the queen who gave England its spine. Church sermons recalled her firmness of faith. Political writers held her up as the embodiment of constitutional monarchy. Never mind that her parliament was more often a tool than a partner. The contradictions were ironed out, the rough edges smoothed, until only the gleaming outline of Gloriana remained. This transformation had as much to do with what Britain needed in the 19th century as with who Elizabeth actually was. As Britain built its empire, it needed founding myths, stories of moral right, historical greatness, and divine favor. Elizabeth became one of those myths, not because her reign was simple or flawless, but because it could be made to seem so. And yet, even then, there were voices that sought to complicate the picture. Writers like Thomas Carlyle and later Lytton Strachey questioned the saintly gloss. They saw in Elizabeth a more human figure, brilliant, yes, but also vain, suspicious, and emotionally volatile. They asked why we so often ignore the costs of power when building our heroes, why we forget the prisoners held in the Tower, the exiles, the political victims of her caution and fear. But for the public, the myth persisted. And into the 20th century, with the rise of mass culture, that myth found new tools. Radio broadcasts commemorated her speeches. Films dramatized her battles and romances. New history books, often written for wide audiences, repackage her life into arcs of triumph, heartbreak, and moral purpose. Her reign was retold as a morality tale, an origin story for modern Britain. She was the queen who protected the Church of England, defeated Catholic Spain, supported Shakespeare, and ruled with unmatched intelligence. In schoolrooms, she remained a fixture. In politics, she was invoked as a standard. And in culture, she was endlessly fascinating. But as historical scholarship matured, so too did the questions surrounding her. Why did Elizabeth really refuse to marry? Was it entirely strategic, or were there personal reasons, perhaps rooted in her childhood trauma? After all, she had witnessed the downfall of her mother and Boleyn, who was executed by her father. She had seen her stepmothers cast aside or killed. Her own legitimacy had been questioned repeatedly. What did that do to a young girl growing into a ruler? Why did she never name a successor? Was it fear of irrelevance? A refusal to acknowledge death? Or was it a way of maintaining political ambiguity so that rivals could not form around a known heir? And what of her cruelty? Her government sanctioned torture, executions, and religious persecution. Her use of spies and informants was unprecedented in English politics. She maintained power not only by inspiring loyalty, but by instilling fear. Is it fair to celebrate her while overlooking those realities? These questions don't diminish her legacy, they deepen it. They remind us that Elizabeth's power was not magic, but mastery. She ruled in a brutal time and survived by outmatching her rivals. Her successes were earned, not granted, and her failures, while often buried beneath the legend, still shaped her reign. In recent decades, historians have revisited Elizabeth not as a goddess or symbol, but as a working monarch, a political survivor who built alliances, crushed enemies, made mistakes, and constantly recalibrated her approach. She was neither a flawless heroine nor a tyrant. She was something far more interesting, a woman navigating power in a world that gave her few models and even fewer tools. This more nuanced view has made her even more compelling. It shows that greatness does not require perfection, that leadership often involves compromise, loneliness, and deep personal cost. In popular media, this complexity is starting to surface. In shows like Elizabeth or 1971, or more recent series like The Crown, the portrayal of monarchy is less about grandeur and more about burden. Viewers see the strain, the calculation, the personal sacrifice behind the pageantry. And while these depictions are fictionalized, they capture something essential, that the crown is not a crown alone. It is a weight. Elizabeth bore that weight longer and more effectively than anyone had expected. And when it finally broke her, when her body gave out and she refused to lie down, she did not release it. Even her death was an act of control. She chose silence over weakness. She gave her people no final speech, no instructions, no closure. And in that silence, she became immortal. For centuries after, England would speak for her, repeating her words, retelling her story, reimagining her life. And in doing so, the legend grew. Elizabeth wasn't just a queen. She was the idea of a queen, timeless, commanding, mysterious. The symbol of an age, and its most enduring echo. As the 21st century unfolded, the legacy of Elizabeth I entered a new arena, one shaped by digital culture, global discourse, and the ever-growing tension between historical record and public memory. No longer confined to books, films, or classrooms, her image now circulated across the internet in memes, social media posts, podcasts, online courses, and streaming documentaries. She was as likely to appear in a historical thread on Twitter as in an academic journal. Her story compressed into digestible summaries or transformed into viral soundbites. And yet, even in this fragmented, fast-moving cultural landscape, Elizabeth endured. In part, this is because her story hits so many of the pressure points of modern identity: power, gender, image, performance, legacy. She was a woman in command in a world that denied women authority. She ruled through spectacle long before optics became political vocabulary. She understood how to create myth, not by accident, but with calculated precision. These qualities resonate in an age where perception often defines reality, where public figures are measured not just by policy or action, but by presence. Modern scholarship has embraced this complexity. Contemporary historians increasingly focus on the mechanisms of Elizabeth's rule, how she maintained control, navigated a hostile political landscape, and built one of the most effective monarchies in English history. They study her letters, which reveal careful strategy and psychological nuance. They analyze court accounts and ambassadorial reports, which highlight how she used ambiguity and delay as tools of diplomacy. They examine her wardrobe, her speeches, her rituals, all of which were means of political communication in an age before mass media. This academic attention has also illuminated aspects of her reign that were once overlooked. For example, her approach to religion is now understood not simply as Protestant zealotry, but as pragmatic governance. She avoided the extreme Protestantism of some of her advisors and resisted calls for more aggressive reform. At the same time, She suppressed Catholicism when it posed political danger, particularly after the Pope excommunicated her and foreign plots threatened her life. Her religious policy was not driven by dogma, but by the pursuit of unity and stability. Similarly, her relationship with Parliament has been re-evaluated. Elizabeth ruled as an absolutist in some respects, controlling appointments, limiting discussion of succession, vetoing legislation. But she also cultivated cooperation, understood the importance of parliamentary consent, and maintained a working balance between royal authority and the voice of the political nation. In an age when many European monarchs fell into despotism or toppled by religious wars, Elizabeth held the line. This balancing act extended into foreign policy. She managed to keep England relatively safe and independent during an age of immense European volatility. She intervened selectively in continental conflicts. She authorized privateers but avoided costly, long-term wars. Even the Armada, though momentous in memory, was part of a broader policy of deterrence and survival, not expansionist fantasy. These insights don't make her reign less impressive. They make it more so. Elizabeth was not carried by divine luck or national momentum. She built her success through careful, often agonizing, choices. She disappointed allies, changed direction, and made compromises when necessary. She ruled with caution more than with daring. But in an age of danger, that caution was revolutionary. And it was deeply personal. Elizabeth's reign was not just a political system. It was an extension of her identity. She refused to share power. She insisted on total control of messaging. Her personality suffused the court. Ministers came and went, but the center held because she made it so. The monarchy was not institutional. It was her. And when she died, it wasn't just the crown that passed to James. It was the entire structure of Tudor political theater, held together by Elizabeth's singular will, that vanished. This is why her death felt like more than a royal transition. It was a rupture. Her silence in her final days, her refusal to name a successor, to give a final word, has become emblematic of her style. Even her departure was shrouded in mystery. She had ruled so long, so completely, that her subjects struggled to imagine a world without her. The emotional weight of that loss transformed her death into a national trauma, which in turn fueled the myth of Gloriana. She didn't fade, she ascended. Today, Elizabeth continues to occupy a liminal space between history and legend. She is taught in schools as a monarch of golden peace. She is studied in universities as a case study in political control. She is dramatized in media as both goddess and ghost. Each version tells a different truth, none fully complete, all part of the larger mosaic. What is remarkable is how little her relevance has faded. In a world where monarchies are increasingly ceremonial, where public figures are constantly scrutinized, where gender and leadership remain hotly debated, Elizabeth's story still feels urgent. She is held up in boardrooms and parliaments as a symbol of female authority. She is evoked in debates about image versus substance. She is compared to modern queens, especially Queen Elizabeth II, whose own long reign drew constant parallels. The comparisons are natural but also revealing. Where Elizabeth I ruled alone, Elizabeth II ruled alongside institutions. Where the first Elizabeth was an actor on the stage of absolute power, the second played a ceremonial role in a constitutional monarchy. Both were defined by restraint, symbolism, and longevity. But their circumstances and challenges were vastly different. And yet, when Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, many headlines referred back to the first Elizabeth. It was as if the nation, once again, was marking the end of an era by invoking its mythic past. Elizabeth I had become the reference point for all queens to follow. Perhaps this is her most lasting legacy, not a specific policy, not a military victory, but the creation of an identity so powerful that it transcends time. She is not remembered because she was flawless. She is remembered because she was unforgettable. She ruled not through domination, but through presence. not by overwhelming her enemies, but by outlasting them. Not with heirs, but with memory. As the reign of Elizabeth I continues to reverberate through the centuries, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Hers was not a legacy built solely on achievement, but on endurance. It is her ability to remain relevant, not just in the annals of history, but in the minds of generations, that sets her apart. And this enduring relevance stems from more than statecraft or national victories. It is born of her mastery over the story of herself. Elizabeth I, in life and death, controlled not only the politics of a kingdom, but the imagination of a people. Unlike most rulers who are remembered for specific reforms or definitive acts of conquest, Elizabeth's legend thrives on paradoxes and questions. How did a woman born under the shadow of illegitimacy become the most iconic monarch in British history? How did a queen who never married become the matriarch of English power? How did someone who ruled with such solitary intensity continue to command loyalty centuries after her death? The answers are elusive because Elizabeth wanted them to be. She cloaked her reign in controlled ambiguity. Her speeches were masterpieces of deliberate vagueness, always saying enough to reassure, but never enough to corner herself. She gave just enough to inspire, never enough to define. Even her motto, Semper Idem, always the same, carried a double edge. It promised consistency, but also veiled the constant reinvention that allowed her to navigate a volatile political world. She was, in a very real sense, a brand centuries before the concept existed. And that brand was reinforced through every medium available to her. Painting, poetry, proclamation, ceremony, clothing, court ritual. Her portraits were not passive reflections, but aggressive projections of power and identity. They declared things she never said aloud. They wrapped her in symbols, the crown, the globe, the sword, the crescent moon, not just to elevate her image, but to script her mythology in real time. These portraits were distributed strategically. Copies were gifted to foreign courts, local magistrates, and noble houses across the kingdom. Every time someone looked upon her image, they weren't seeing a mere likeness. They were being reminded of a narrative, of divine right, of stability, of the permanence of the Tudor order. This visual messaging filled the vacuum left by her refusal to share power or produce an heir. In place of dynasty, she gave symbol. In place of family, she gave nation. And the nation accepted her terms. Elizabeth's public identity as the Virgin Queen was one of her most ingenious political tools. In a world where queens were expected to marry and produce heirs, her refusal was radical. She flipped the script, making her singleness not a liability, but the cornerstone of her mystique. It allowed her to avoid factionalism, sidestep foreign entanglements, and present herself as married to England itself. Of course, this identity was also intensely theatrical. It required discipline, consistency, and a carefully cultivated aura. Behind a mask, Elizabeth was deeply human. She was known to be jealous, suspicious, and emotionally intense. She played favorites. She punished disloyalty with precision. She experienced heartbreak and loss, and sometimes made decisions that were cruel or cowardly. But she never allowed these elements to dominate the narrative. Instead, she elevated her humanity into something otherworldly. This paradox, of a woman simultaneously vulnerable and untouchable, has fascinated generations. Historians, artists, and writers have all wrestled with it. Some see Elizabeth as a proto-feminist hero, others as a political pragmatist whose success came at enormous personal cost. Still others view her as a political illusionist who mastered the tools of Renaissance monarchy better than any of her male peers. What few dispute is that her success was improbable and yet complete. Born the daughter of a disgraced queen and a tyrannical king, declared illegitimate, nearly executed, imprisoned by her own sister, Elizabeth should not have ascended the throne. And even if she had, she was not expected to hold it. The world of the 16th century was not built to support a woman in power, let alone a woman alone in power. But Elizabeth did not merely survive. She ruled, and did so on her own terms. When she died in 1603, she left behind a kingdom vastly different from the one she inherited. England was wealthier, more stable, more confident, and more connected to the wider world. It was on the verge of becoming a global empire. It had weathered religious conflict, foreign threats, and internal dissent. And it had done so under the reign of a queen who refused to be predictable, manageable, or diminished. Her death was not just the end of a life, but the end of a constructed world. The political theater that she had orchestrated for 44 years collapsed the moment she breathed her last. Her court dissolved, her personal rituals ceased, and her image passed into the hands of others. The silence she left behind, so deliberate, so defiant, became the canvas on which the future painted its version of her. And what they painted was extraordinary. In the 17th century, she was remembered as the monarch who had defended Protestantism and defied Spain. In the 18th, she was invoked as the mother of empire. In the 19th, she became the emblem of Victorian virtue. In the 20th, she was celebrated as a model of female independence. And in the 21st, she is re-examined as a complex, contradictory, and fiercely intelligent ruler who outwitted a system designed to break her. That each generation finds something new in Elizabeth speaks not to historical confusion, but to her enduring power as a symbol. She means different things to different people, and she always has. For some, she is a figure of national pride. For others, a cautionary tale of power and loneliness. For others still, she is the proof that women can lead, shape history, and outshine expectations. But above all, she is a reminder that history is not made only by battles and laws. It is made by people. People who understand themselves, understand the world they live in, and understand how to move through that world with purpose. Elizabeth I understood. She understood that to rule a kingdom, she had to rule its imagination. That to endure, she had to become more than mortal. And that to become a legend, she had to leave just enough untold. She did. By the time the early modern period gave way to modernity, Elizabeth I had become far more than a remembered monarch. She was a foundation stone of England's national mythology. But with the rise of more critical and diverse historical inquiry in the 21st century, her image has begun to be dissected in even greater detail. What once passed as celebration is now tempered with interrogation. What was once seen as divine rule is now analyzed as the product of careful human engineering. Yet despite this, her place at the center of English identity remains surprisingly secure. Why? Because Elizabeth didn't just respond to the politics of her time. She anticipated the shape of political power to come. She ruled in an age when monarchs relied on divine justification, bloodlines, and military strength. But her reign foreshadowed a new kind of authority, one rooted in narrative, in imagery, in public spectacle. She ruled by creating a story, and then living inside it so convincingly that the story became real. Even today, this kind of power feels deeply familiar. In a world saturated with branding, media, and performance, Elizabeth's techniques are not relics, they're blueprints. Think of how she navigated foreign alliances. Rather than tethering herself to one power through marriage, she positioned herself as a perpetual possibility, a queen courted by kings and princes across Europe, always keeping the door slightly open, never quite closing the deal. This ambiguity allowed her to manipulate diplomatic channels with a flexibility her married counterparts could never manage. She was always in negotiation, but never beholden. Or consider her domestic strategy. Elizabeth knew that stability did not come from force alone. It came from appearing indispensable. She spent years cultivating an image as the loving mother of the nation, the protector of peace, the bringer of unity. She walked among her people when it suited her. She gave dazzling addresses at critical moments. And all the while, she fostered dependence, not just among her courtiers, but among the very idea of Englishness. England, for over 4 decades, did not simply have a queen. It had Elizabeth, but her power was never absolute. She lived under constant threat of assassination, rebellion, invasion. Her legitimacy was always vulnerable to challenge. The Pope had declared her illegitimate and excommunicated her. Catholic powers across Europe plotted to dethrone her. Protestant extremists questioned her religious moderation. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was a living threat until she was finally executed in 1587. Elizabeth balanced these threats with remarkable deftness. She used spies, propaganda, and political delay as weapons. She isolated threats before they could become crises, and she maintained the illusion of unity even when division simmered beneath the surface. She wasn't a warrior queen in the traditional sense. She led no armies, fought no battles with sword in hand. But she was a tactician, and her battlefield was perception. This mastery of perception extended into her death. No dramatic final words, no farewell speech, no designation of a successor. She left the stage in the same way she had ruled, on her own terms, cloaked in silence, leaving others to interpret what it all meant. In doing so, she maintained control of her story, even as that story passed into the hands of her successors. The first of those successors, James I, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a narrative and an impossible standard. He had none of her mystique, none of her presence, and very little of her emotional intelligence. He was scholarly, intellectual, and politically tone-deaf. And he quickly discovered that England was not yet ready to leave Elizabeth behind. Parliament remained deeply loyal to the image of the Virgin Queen. Poets and pamphleteers continued to write about her. Ordinary people still lit bonfires on November 17th to mark the day of her accession. Even court officials, many of whom had served her for decades, maintained their loyalty to her memory long after her death. This loyalty outlived her in ways no one could have predicted. During the English Civil War, royalists and parliamentarians both invoked her example. One side claimed to be defending her model of wise monarchy. The other side pointed to her supposed respect for parliament and moderation in power. Both views were distortions, but both reveal just how deeply Elizabeth had been embedded in the national conscience. And the fact that she could be used by both sides only made her more powerful. That's the enduring paradox of Elizabeth I. She was conservative and radical, regal and populist, elusive and ever-present. She was a monarch who made herself indispensable, and in doing so, made herself eternal. Even centuries later, her reign is used as a benchmark. When Britain faced external threats in World War II, it wasn't uncommon for writers to draw parallels between Elizabeth's resistance to the Armada and Britain's resilience during the Blitz. When Margaret Thatcher rose to power in the 1980s, comparisons to Elizabeth's authority and isolation as a female leader abounded. When Queen Elizabeth II passed her own milestones of longevity, commentators inevitably looked backward to Elizabeth I. But while modern monarchs have ruled as part of institutions, Elizabeth ruled as an institution unto herself. Her court was not merely a hub of administration. It was a theater of control. Her speeches were not just rhetoric. They were rituals of sovereignty. Her image was not just representation. It was currency. She understood, with startling clarity, that to lead was to appear irreplaceable. And in that, she succeeded. Even in her vulnerabilities, her aging, her grief, her obsessive control, she revealed nothing that could puncture the myth. She managed her personal pain as she managed her public life, behind a veil, beneath a crown, through symbols and silence. Today, we study Elizabeth not because we long for monarchs, but because we remain fascinated by mastery. She was not born to rule. She clawed her way to power through intellect, resilience, and a willingness to become the image her country needed. She was not always kind, or even consistent, but she was unforgettable. And perhaps, in the end, that was the point. Section 18. By the time England moved into the Enlightenment and the modern constitutional era, the shadow of Elizabeth I still loomed large, not in the governance of the country, which had evolved far beyond the personal monarchy she once embodied, but in the national memory, which continued to treasure her as a cornerstone of British identity. Long after kings were beheaded, parliaments emboldened, and monarchs relegated to ceremonial roles, Elizabeth retained something more enduring than power. She retained presence. This presence was no longer just national. It became global. As the British Empire expanded across continents, the Elizabethan myth was exported along with ships, laws, and flags. In India, Africa, the Americas, and Australia, colonial administrators often framed the empire's mission as an echo of Elizabeth's so-called Golden Age. Her name appeared in place names, her face on coins, her symbolism in speeches and civic ceremonies. For an empire in need of historical legitimacy, Elizabeth provided it in spades. But as colonial narratives began to be questioned in the 20th and 21st centuries, so too did the myth that underpinned them. In post-colonial studies and global historiography, the image of Elizabeth as the benign mother of empire has been sharply reevaluated. Scholars point out that her support for early colonizers like Raleigh and Gilbert wasn't merely adventurous. It laid the groundwork for exploitation and conquest. The Elizabethan voyages of discovery were often accompanied by violence, enslavement, and resource extraction. What had once been seen as the seeds of global civilization are now viewed, more soberly, as the early stages of imperialism. This reappraisal hasn't erased Elizabeth's stature. It has complicated it. And that complexity has only made her story more compelling. She was a queen who launched exploration but never saw the lands claimed in her name. A Protestant icon who governed with the pragmatism of a realist. A feminist symbol who upheld patriarchal order. A national hero who presided over persecution and execution. She is, in every way, an emblem of contradiction. And yet, despite this, or because of it, her relevance endures. In modern academic discourse, Elizabeth is not studied as a relic of royal nostalgia. She is studied as a case study in leadership, identity, and power. Entire courses are dedicated to her use of political theater, to her survival in a system that was designed to consume her, and to the cultural framework she constructed and left behind. One reason she continues to captivate is that so few historical figures blend such vast historical consequence with such personal mystery. We know so much about her world, her letters, her court, her foreign policy, but we know so little about her private self. She left no personal diary. Her love life is still the subject of speculation. Her final thoughts, her deepest regrets, her unspoken dreams, all remain unknowable. And that unknowability is powerful. Elizabeth forces historians to ask not only what she did, but what she meant. Not only how she governed, but why she still governs the imagination. In many ways, she represents a fulcrum in English history. Before her reign, the Tudor dynasty was defined by bloodshed, instability, and religious violence. After her reign, the Stuarts would lead England into civil war, regicide, and constitutional revolution. Elizabeth was the calm between storms, but it was a calm crafted, not found. A calm earned through vigilance, sacrifice, and mastery of image. Her ability to project unity, even when surrounded by division, is something leaders still aspire to today. In boardrooms and classrooms, in politics and popular culture, the idea of Elizabeth as the master of controlled power persists. She is quoted in leadership seminars, dramatized in literature and television, and invoked, often without irony, as a model of poise under pressure. Her speeches, particularly the one at Tilbury, are still recited by students and politicians alike. Her portraits still adorn walls. Her legend still lives in the cultural bloodstream of nations that no longer kneel to monarchs. And in fiction, she is reborn again and again. Each new portrayal tells a different version of the same truth, that Elizabeth's reign is inexhaustible as a narrative. Some versions highlight her youthful rise, the fear and courage it took to hold the crown, when the world expected her to fail. Others dwell on her age, her isolation, her long twilight in Richmond Palace, pacing in silence, refusing to lie down. Still others explore her court, her favorites, her impossible choices, and the immense pressure of sovereignty without intimacy. None of them can capture her fully, but none of them need to, because Elizabeth, more than any other monarch, exists in the gaps between versions. She is the face painted white, the voice that trembled with command, the mind that turned uncertainty into advantage. She is the queen who never married, who loved carefully and ruled fiercely. The monarch who called herself mere woman, but lived like an institution. She ruled through spectacle, but her legacy is more than performance. It is rooted in endurance, in the sheer, staggering fact that she remained on the throne, unbroken, for 44 years through war, plague, assassination attempts, and internal strife. That she outlasted her enemies, that she defined an age. It's that survival that echoes the loudest. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest legacy may be her refusal to be erased. Her story, like her reign, resists closure. There is always more to say, more to uncover, more to imagine. And so we continue to return to her, not because we need monarchs, but because we recognize something in her that transcends time. She is history's unfinished sentence. Section 19. By the time we reach the present, Elizabeth I no longer belongs solely to England, or to monarchy, or even to history. She has become something broader, a cultural archetype, endlessly adaptable, endlessly retold. She is invoked in contexts far beyond the 16th century. Her story used to illuminate not just the past, but the present. And in doing so, she has transcended the crown she once wore. She has become a metaphor. In leadership seminars, she is cited for her ability to maintain authority in a hostile environment. In feminist discourse, she is held up as a model of agency in a world that offered women none. In film and television, she is cast as the tragic heroine, the political chess master, the unbreakable sovereign, or the lonely woman at the top. She is not one thing. She is many things, and that perhaps is the truest reflection of power. Elizabeth's most remarkable quality may not be her policies or her court, but her capacity to contain multitudes. She was theatrical but serious, isolated but adored, calculating but warm when it suited her. She could be both the maternal mother of the nation and the fierce orator who rallied troops against invasion. She could flirt with courtiers and simultaneously deny them real intimacy. She could show favor, then withdraw it. She could hold court like a goddess, but weep in private over betrayal. This emotional complexity, so long buried beneath the myths, is what modern scholarship seeks to recover. Not to tear down Elizabeth's legacy, but to make it real. To show that her greatness was not supernatural, but forged in the fire of experience. That the woman who became Gloriana was also the girl who survived the tower, who navigated the treacherous politics of her siblings' reigns, and who faced execution more than once before she ever wore the crown. We know more about her fears now. Her refusal to name a successor was likely more than political strategy. It was an expression of deep-rooted anxiety, a fear that acknowledging the end of her reign would weaken her grip on power. Her obsession with appearance wasn't just vanity, it was armor. Her aversion to illness and death was not just superstition. It was the terror of a woman who had spent her entire life proving she could survive in a man's world, only to realize that mortality could not be outwitted. And still she ruled. She ruled longer than any monarch before her. She ruled more effectively than many after. She navigated one of the most dangerous periods in European history without plunging her country into war, bankruptcy, or tyranny. Her leadership was not perfect, but it was stable. Her decisions were not always wise, but they were rarely catastrophic. Her policies may not have pleased everyone, but they kept the nation intact. The ultimate irony of Elizabeth's reign is that the very things that defined it, ambiguity, performance, control, also make her legacy so difficult to categorize. We search her story for clean conclusions, moral lessons, dramatic resolutions. But Elizabeth offers none. She remains opaque even in her most visible moments. She wrote no memoirs. She shared no confessions. Her final breath was not accompanied by a grand farewell. That silence, again, is the echo we return to. The death of Elizabeth I left a void that her successor, James I, could not fill. Nor was he expected to. He was a king, but not a myth. He had heirs, but no aura. And though he would lay the foundation for the eventual unification of England and Scotland, his reign lacked the cohesion, the charisma, and the emotional hold that Elizabeth had exercised over her subjects. He ruled with pens and papers. She had ruled with presence. And in that contrast, Elizabeth's brilliance is further revealed. In many ways, she invented a kind of leadership that we still recognize today. Leadership as narrative, as identity, as spectacle. She understood, far ahead of her time, that to command loyalty in a fractured world, a leader had to become more than flesh and blood. She had to become a symbol. Elizabeth became that symbol, and carefully managed it until the very end. She choreographed her public appearances with the discipline of a director. She layered her language with meaning, ambiguity, and metaphor. She turned even her silences into instruments of policy. And she did all this while maintaining the illusion of divine right, even as she operated with the cold logic of a pragmatist. It is no surprise, then, that her name lives on. Elizabethan England is still a term of cultural pride. The Elizabethan era is taught as a time of literary genius, maritime achievement, and national unity. Even critics who seek to reframe her reign must first acknowledge its centrality. She is, quite simply, unavoidable, and perhaps that is what she always intended. Elizabeth ruled without a husband, without children, and without a formal dynasty to carry her legacy. But what she created instead was a dynasty of memory, a lineage not of blood, but of influence. Every powerful woman who has risen since, from monarchs to prime ministers, has done so in the shadow of Elizabeth I, whether they claim her or not. She was not the first woman to rule, but she was the first to rule as woman and sovereign without apology, without compromise, and without collapse. Her life is studied not only because she succeeded, but because of how she succeeded, through mastery of narrative, through the crafting of identity, through endurance, and through silence. The silence of her final moments, her refusal to lie down, her withdrawal into shadows, was not a vanishing act. It was a final, wordless performance, a parting gesture from a queen who had always spoken best through symbols. Section 20. Now, we arrive at the end of the story, a story that began in danger, unfolded in spectacle, and concluded in silence. But as we close the final chapter of Elizabeth I's life, one truth becomes inescapable. Her ending was not an ending at all. It was a transformation. She may have died alone, without husband, without heir, without a voice to speak her last thoughts. But what she left behind was something far more enduring than lineage. She left behind a myth, crafted in life, cemented in death, and passed through centuries not as simple fact, but as a living, breathing idea. It is rare in history for any individual to transcend the context of their time. Most are bound by the era they occupy, made by it, shaped by it, eventually forgotten with it. Elizabeth escaped that fate. She is remembered not just as the last Tudor monarch, but as something greater. She is remembered as the spirit of a nation at a time when England was becoming itself, when the Reformation was solidifying, when the English language was flourishing, when the seeds of global exploration were taking root. She stood at the nexus of all of it, not simply witnessing the transformation, but directing it. And she did it her way, without a king beside her, without yielding to foreign alliances, without being reduced to a pawn in a larger game. Her story is not just about triumph. It is about the cost of survival, about loneliness, about image, about the weaponization of femininity in a world that was built to strip women of power, about holding onto a crown with both hands because to let go would mean obliteration, about turning fear into form. vulnerability into strength. Elizabeth never claimed to be perfect. She did not invite intimacy from her people, but she gave them a monarch they could believe in, one whose endurance reassured them, whose strength gave them cover, whose mystery kept them watching. And that watching has never truly stopped. She remains in the curriculum, in the portraits, in the plays, in the royal lineage, if not by blood then by myth. She remains in the way we tell stories of power, in the ways we measure leadership, in the language we use when describing what it means to be sovereign, to be singular, to be iconic. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the headlines again invoked her namesake. Comparisons were drawn, not because the reigns were alike in policy or temperament, but because they were bookends to an idea that a woman on the throne, ruling with longevity, grace, and complexity, still captures the imagination in a way few men ever have. And this is perhaps the final truth about Elizabeth I that she understood. At her core, that people remember stories more than statistics, that they remember symbols more than strategy. And so, she gave them a symbol crafted not out of mere chance, but out of calculation, out of brilliance, out of necessity. She did not just wear the crown. She became it. In the final days at Richmond Palace, when she stood for hours, refusing to lie down, refusing food, refusing rest, her courtiers did not know what to make of it. Some said she was mad. Some said she was grieving. Others believed she was fighting to the last. But in hindsight, we can see it clearly. She was staging her exit. One last act in a life lived as theater, as war, as survival, as spectacle. She was leaving behind the image she had always wanted. The sovereign who would not bend, even to death. The queen who stood when others fell. The ruler who departed without explanation, as though she would return at any moment. And in a way, she did. Every time her image is shown, every time her words are quoted, every time a woman steps into power and is measured by her example, Elizabeth returns. Not as flesh, but as fire. Not as a monarch, but as a myth. And myths do not die. They evolve. They adapt. They haunt. Elizabeth I still haunts the throne she left behind. Not with sorrow or warning, but with presence. A presence so vast that history cannot contain her. Only memory can. We began with a question. What may have caused the death of Elizabeth I? The answer, as you now know, is many things. Age, illness, sorrow, perhaps poison, perhaps grief. But beyond those mortal causes lies something deeper. A woman who chose the terms of her rule and the terms of her departure. A woman who walked through history with the crown on her head and the nation in her hands. And who, in her silence, said everything. She ruled. She endured. She remained. And she remains still. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far into the journey, consider subscribing to the channel for more long-form explorations of history's most complex and powerful figures. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what happened. It's who tells the story. And few ever told it better than Elizabeth I.